I went through over 100,000 breeding records in eBird, and while this seems like the ultimate success of contributory science, allowing us to map the breeding distributions of hundreds of birds, my biggest takeaway is that most people contributing are actually using breeding codes wrong. If you're new here, I'm Doug Hitchcock. My goal is to get the most people to see the most birds, and in this video, I'm going to cover how breeding codes work in eBird. There are three key concepts that I think everyone should know, and I'll explain each code and the errors that you should avoid using them, and then end by looking at how breeding codes are reviewed, because you might be surprised to learn that your records can actually be changed. This will be a longer video, so feel free to use the little chapters below to find the parts that are relevant to you. The first and most important concept about using breeding codes is, if you aren't sure if you should use one, don't. While eBird has regional filters and uses historic data to tell you what species are likely to be around and how rare they are, there are not any filters for breeding codes. I often tell new birders they don't need to worry too much about using eBird because there are enough checks that will prevent them from reporting a rare species or even too many. But there isn't anything preventing you from adding the wrong code. You could report an American herring gull singing in December, despite that being months before they start breeding, and they don't even sing, yet nothing in eBird will stop you. So let me just reiterate, if you are unsure, don't add a code. And fortunately, by the time you get done with this video, you'll know exactly what codes to use and when. The next concept that we should touch on is what breeding codes are used for. You may notice that despite being able to add these codes to your sightings, there aren't any outputs in eBird that take advantage of these. It is only in breeding bird atlases, now part of eBird projects, where codes are displayed on maps restricted to that individual region. I really wish we could see some of the breeding information outside of atlases. If not on maps, it would be a great addition to illustrated checklists or hotspot bird lists. But I guess this goes back to my concern earlier where breeding codes aren't being filtered or reviewed. So if we're added now, it may all just be wrong and too much of a mess to fix. You'll only see these codes outputted in atlases, but the data is available to anyone accessing eBird data. So it's worth reporting codes even if there isn't an atlas underway in your area. If you are using them, remember these are breeding codes and are meant to document breeding behavior. If you saw a piping plover on a beach in Bermuda, you wouldn't report that as being, quote, inappropriate habitat because they are hundreds of miles and many months from breeding, despite being on a sandy beach. Or if you're birding along the Gulf Coast in spring and a Tennessee warbler is singing from the bushes, yes, that is its song, but no, it's not actually trying to attract a mate there. These are technically behavior codes, not breeding codes, but I'll save that bit of confusion for the end of the video. I'll go through all the codes in a minute, but want to point out that these are a standard set of behaviors that indicate whether a bird is possibly, probably, or a confirmed breeder in an area. This is the gradient you see on eBird's breeding maps, and yes, it can be very confusing since they use the same color to show frequency on the typical range maps. These are pretty standard codes for any project, but you should always follow the guidelines set by the project that you're contributing to. Another critically important thing to know about using breeding codes is that there is a hierarchy among them. This is more obvious when you use the web-based version of eBird because it clearly says choose the highest possible code on a vertical drop-down list. This is a little less obvious on the app where codes are in rows, but going from lowest possible codes, reading left to right, and going down to confirmed codes. So I tried making this visual that helps show the relationship of these codes. I like to think of it by answering these two questions. Do you know exactly where the bird nested? And were they successful? Specifically meaning, did they produce young? At one end of the spectrum, we have the highest code, which is NY for nest with young. And we have the obvious answers to my question. Yes, we know exactly where they were because we can see the nest. And yes, we know they were successful because there's the young. At the other end of the spectrum, we find the lowest possible code, H, for inappropriate habitat. And the answer is no. We don't know exactly where the bird nested, and no, we don't know if they were successful. With H, you don't even really know if they tried. If we go back to the top of the spectrum and stick with the example where we know exactly where the nest is, we get the codes like nest with egg, which is a little less successful than the NY code. An occupied nest is going to be even less successful. Used nest fits somewhere up here. And then nest building. We don't know if it'll even be occupied, but we still know exactly where the nest is. Other codes that we know result from successful nesting are an adult carrying a fecal sac, feeding young away from the nest means they've been successful, recently fledged can definitely be wandering from the nest site, and then carrying food comes up as one where you could have an active nest but you don't know where it is. A distraction display means that there's a nest or possibly chicks nearby, but the lack of certainty of their nesting success or where that nest is bumps it a little lower. And our last confirmed code, carrying nesting material, is only about halfway on our success spectrum and definitely lower than yes for knowing exactly where. Into the probable codes, a bird being agitated by your presence is a pretty good indicator that there is nesting, but only lands about halfway on both of our spectrums. A bird showing physiological evidence means that the bird is ready to breed, but these can even show up on a bird during migration. The wren and woodpecker nest building code has enough nuance that I'll save for the deeper dive later, but trust me, for now it's down here. Visiting a probable nest site is tricky because they might not actually use the site, and we're now getting pretty low on having any idea how successful they're going to be. This last cluster with courtship behavior, birds being territorial, a pair in suitable habitat, or a bird singing for 7 or more days, all fits in this pretty low success, low precision corner, with the multiple singing birds being barely above the other possible codes. Singing is just above habitat since that bird is at least trying to put some effort rather than just being in the right place at the right time. Alright, with these concepts out of the way, let's start looking at the codes more in depth. We'll start from the bottom and work our way up, beginning with the possible codes. Because possible codes are such a low evidence of breeding, there's even more emphasis on the time of year where these can be used. You can actually see in the definition of the codes that they both specify use during the breeding season. We've already talked about the core concept of using these codes within a species' breeding range, but these may also be restricted by dates. For your general eBirding, you may not need to be too worried about dates, but if you are contributing to a certain project like a breeding bird atlas, then there will likely be a specific set of safe dates for you to follow. The term safe date is a little confusing because you often see birds doing much higher breeding codes before the start of the safe dates, but the idea is that once you are in the safe dates, the species is no longer migrating and should be within its breeding territory. So all of the confirmed and most of the probable codes supersede safe dates, while a couple probable and then all of these possible codes can only be used within the safe dates. The first possible code is H, inappropriate habitat. This code might seem pretty straightforward, but it does require additional knowledge about a species and knowing exactly what habitat preferences they have for nesting. Most field guides or even websites like allaboutbirds.org will have at least a brief description of nesting habitat for most birds. Mistakes I usually see are a difference between the habitat the bird is using for foraging versus what they actually need for nesting. So a great blue heron foraging along a stream seems like the right habitat for them, but their appropriate nesting habitat is going to be more like a flooded beaver pond with dead trees. Or it makes a big difference seeing a loon in the summertime, whether it's on freshwater, appropriate habitat, or on saltwater, inappropriate habitat. Our other possible code is S, singing bird. Another one that seems straightforward, but remember that birds can sing while on migration or even before leaving their wintering grounds, and those should not be coded as singing. I've been listening to an American tree sparrow starting to sing here in Maine during these early spring days, but those birds are hundreds of miles from where their actual breeding territories are. And I should emphasize that you may need to know exactly what a bird's song is. Some species have very large vocal repertoires, but generally only have one noise that is considered a song. Carolina wrens make all sorts of noise, but it is only the male's rolling tea kettle, tea kettle, tea kettle that is actually their song. And keep in mind that not all songs are vocal, some are mechanical, like the drumming of most woodpeckers is considered their song because it is used to attract a mate or defend territory. Let's move on to the next category, probable. The first, or lowest category here, is S7, singing bird present for 7 or more days. If a bird is previously reported as singing and is still singing on territory after 7 or more days, you can bump it up to this probable code. The obvious problem is being able to keep track of an individual between visits, but this is easiest with birds that use the same perch to sing from. Another very low code is M, multiple, 7 or more singing birds. This one is tricky because you should consider distance between those birds. Most atlases just need 7 or more singing birds within an atlas block to use this code, so those 7 birds might be spread across multiple eBird lists. I will point out that the NORAC working group debated the validity of this code, with some pointing out that if there are 7 singing birds, then one of them is bound to show some higher breeding code than this, going so far as to say it isn't worth jeopardizing Atlas data by using, quote, sloppy codes. They eventually voted 5-2 against M being an acceptable code. One with less drama is P, pair in suitable habitat. This is another one that, as the description says, should be used within safe dates. This is mostly going to be used with sexually dimorphic species where you can easily tell males and females apart. Looking for some behavioral cue that they are a pair is important, like staying close or following each other around. Even in species where sexes are similar, you can still see males shadowing females as a sign you've got a pair. Next up is T, territorial defense. Defined as permanent territory presumed through defense of breeding territory by fighting or chasing individuals of the same species. The biggest confusion I've seen with this code is behavior that should actually be agitated, not territorial. So the important thing to remember is that territorial defense is intraspecific, where agitated is interspecific. I most often see this when there's a male teed up, singing on territory, and you'll see them zip off to chase off an intruder, and usually return back to their original perch. Perhaps one of the most entertaining categories is C, for courtship, display, or copulation. Copulation is typically a brief colloquial kiss, but courtship can be longer and quite elaborate. There are some very well-known displays like the American woodcock's aerial flights, drumming and lecking from grouse, and some easy to see like the wing-up courtship flights of chimney swifts. One thing to be aware of is the confusion between the confirmed code for feeding young and courtship feeding. We saw this a few times with the Maine Bird Atlas where people reported feeding young, but it was way too early in the season for chicks to have even hatched. Another misinterpretation adding to the confusion was the observer saying that the recipient of the food was fluttering its wings, like a baking fledgling would, but females will often do something similar as a pre-copulatory display. So make sure you are properly aging the birds involved or consider the time of year in interpreting this behavior. Continuing on, N, visiting probable nest site. My only advice here is not to jump to conclusions on this one. As it says in the description, this should probably be repeated visits to a potential nest site. The common example I think of is eastern bluebirds visiting boxes, especially ones they've historically nested in. The hesitation is that those prominent spots might just be good for foraging from, but looking for them to actually enter the box is a strong case for using this code. If in doubt, you could still code this as pair in suitable habitat. Up next is a quick revisit of A for agitated behavior, defined as agitated behavior or anxiety calls from an adult. This excludes responses elicited by pishing, playing recordings, or mobbing behavior that species engage in year-round, for instance, mobbing an owl. Remember, this is an interspecific reaction, and something showing that the bird very likely has a nest nearby. This is a good time to point out just how high we are in the probable codes, and it's often easy to bump this into a confirmed code just by watching the bird a little bit longer. To be clear, if a bird is agitated because of your presence, you should move back or further along to no longer disturb that bird. Then watching from afar, you are pretty likely to see why that bird was agitated, as it'll probably return to its nest or start gathering food for its young. As a side note, for the Maine Bird Atlas, we decided to count agitated behavior as a confirmed code for American goshawks. Those birds are so aggressive around their nests that we didn't want anyone getting hurt trying to confirm them, so we made that exception. These last two are pretty uncommon, but first is B for woodpecker/wren nest building, defined as some species, including certain wrens, woodpeckers, and certain other cavity nesters, may build dummy nests, and thus nest building activity cannot be considered confirmation. To elaborate on that description, with many of those species, the males will build many nests or dummy nests to claim potential sites. Then when a female arrives, she will choose which of those they'll use as their actual nest. Northern house wrens are pretty famous for this, filling every birdhouse in your backyard, often before females even migrate back. And beware of woodpeckers potentially making a cavity as a roost site, but often you can factor in time of year or just revisit the hole later to see if it's being used for nesting. And finally, we get to physiological evidence. The important thing to realize here is that most of these physiological signs are only detected when you've got a bird in the hand. So banders are going to detect a brood patch, the bare patch on the stomach of a female that allows for better heat transfer when incubating, or a colloquial protuberance, the swollen genitals of a jacked up male. But most birders will never use this code. I definitely want to caution birders who see a preening bird and think they see a brood patch. I've seen enough people mistake birds spreading their feather tracks down their belly, often exposing a dark patch that they think is a brood patch. But any bird can really show that, and trust me, it isn't a brood patch. Aside from at a banding station, the only time I've seen a brood patch was on a recently deceased bird. I've seen both window strikes and birds hit by cars that had brood patches. Alright, we're moving into the highest tier, confirmed. Lowest in this group is CN for carrying nesting material. Sticks, twigs, and grass are pretty easy to see, but keep in mind that some material can be especially hard to detect, like a barn swallow with a mouthful of mud. This is usually pretty obvious behavior, but some things to keep in mind are that raptors will often grab sticks and leaves when holding onto their prey. It can also sometimes be hard to tell the difference between prey and nesting material, especially with a distant hawk, and can be hard to tell a snake from a stick that's being carried away. The next code is pretty intuitive, NB for nest building. Stepping up from carrying nesting material, if you can see where the material is being used, you've got NB. We already discussed the species where this behavior is only probable when we discussed the B code, but for just about everything else, we've got this one. I want to pause here to acknowledge an ethical consideration, which is that by the time we are detecting a bird at its nest, we are probably beginning to decrease their chances of success. By hanging around a nest, you can cause the bird to abandon the site, your presence could keep parents away from making a food delivery, or your scent could even attract predators to the nest. So I feel it is important that we limit our disturbance around a nest, or even with any of these behaviors. And that is kind of a fun part of these confirmed codes. You don't have to find a nest with young to confirm a bird as breeding. Just seeing a bird carrying nesting material is going to be good enough for most projects. Along these same lines, we get to our next code, DD, a distraction display. This is another code that doesn't require you to see an actual nest or young, but based on a parent's behavior, we can call this confirmed. Killdeer or other shorebirds are probably best known for their broken wing displays, but quite a few species will do this. We had reports of common nighthawks faking a broken wing during the Maine Bird Atlas, and I remember an almost comical display of a palm warbler practically rolling around on the ground when I must have been too close to a nest during a survey. UN, used nest, is a funky one because it generally goes against eBird's rules of not submitting any zero counts on a list. But if you find an old nest and the species isn't present, you can still report the breeding confirmation by entering a 0 and UN. Some problems here are that eBird really isn't built for zeros, and even within the breeding maps, the zeros don't show up. It is also worth pointing out that nests can be really hard to tell who made them, at least down to the species level. It also helps to know seasonally what's more likely. Here in the Northeast, I know American goldfinches and the second broods of red-eyed vireos are going to be some of the last built nests of the year, so those tend to persist into the fall. Next up is ON, or occupied nest, which we presume by a parent entering and remaining, or exchanging of incubation duties. This is most likely to be used when you can't see the nest, or really into the nest, usually because it is high in a tree or inside a cavity. Or sometimes an adult will be sitting on a nest throughout your observation, so you don't know if there are eggs, young, or possibly neither yet. There are some cases where you can infer that an adult is occupying a nest, but always good to use this with caution. Chimney swifts are a good example where you can't see a nest, but you can make a good assumption that there is an active nest based on their behavior. Chicks are going to be fed approximately every 20 minutes, so if you see a chimney swift repeatedly entering a chimney in the summer, you can safely code this as ON. Because it isn't a certainty that there are young, so don't use NY, and you probably can't see them carrying any food because they'll regurgitate insects, so don't use CF, this slightly lower code is still confirmed and is better to use. Next up is probably the most misused code, FL, recently fledged young, for recently fledged young or downy young observed while still dependent on adults. In my experience, having reviewed thousands of records for the main bird atlas, birders overuse this code, applying it to any bird they can identify as being in juvenile plumage. And I think the problem is with this subjective word recently, where some people interpret that as longer than it should be. This code should be used with birds that likely haven't moved far from the nest site. As the description says, they will still have some of their downy feathers, or one thing I look for is a short tail. Tail feathers are typically the longest on a bird's body and will take the longest for a chick to grow out, so a not fully grown tail is usually a good sign of a recently fledged bird. Again, just because you see a young robin with speckled on the chest doesn't mean that it qualifies as recently fledged. That bird could have already moved many miles from its nest, so it shouldn't be coded as a confirmed record. One of the easiest codes to see is CF, carrying food. In most cases, if you see an adult bird carrying food, it is because it's going to feed its young somewhere. It would otherwise be a waste of energy for an adult to be carrying food around that it isn't going to consume itself. Of course, there are some major exceptions. Raptors will often carry the prey long distances before they find a safe place to consume it. Just think of all the osprey you see flying around carrying fish. There's no way to know if it's just for them or it's going to end up in a nest. Corvids are tricky too. I've seen crows flying around with food, be it carrion or even garbage, in the middle of winter, certainly not bringing it to a nest. And there are some species like terns where food is used in courtship and delivered to a mate. CF should not be used with these birds. The last one that I'll mention is species that cache food. A chickadee carrying a seed away from your feeder should not be coded as CF, and trust me, many people unfortunately do. FY for feeding young. This is a pretty straightforward code, although we saw it used wrong surprisingly often. The emphasis here is that the young are out of the nest. We saw this code used most frequently with birds that were still in the nest, which based on the naming makes sense, but based on the code's hierarchy, you'd want to use nest with young. As a tip, most of the time you find a recently fledged bird, if you watch it for a few minutes, you're probably going to see it be fed. Speaking of feeding young, if food goes in, a fecal sac usually comes out, so we get to our next code, FS, carrying fecal sac. Most passerines defecate in a membrane called a fecal sac, much like a bird diaper, that adults will carry away from the nest to keep it sanitary. These will usually be carried away a short distance and dropped. Some species seem to specifically look for water to deposit it in, but this can often be easier to see than a food delivery being carried in. Our last two codes are exactly what you'd think. NE, nest with eggs, and NY, nest with young, are just that. Maybe the one thing to note is that you don't have to see the young to use NY. Often, especially with a cavity, you may just hear the young begging from inside. As a reminder, don't count eggs in the species totals you report on your list, but you do count hatched young. Before we move on, I want to mention that there are many unique examples to which codes apply to which species and in which situations. That is probably one of the coolest parts of watching birds, that this behavior is so diverse, but more than I can cover here. A couple worth specifically pointing out have to do with mixed species coding. For brood parasites like brown-headed cowbird, you can code both species as being confirmed when you find something like an eastern phoebe nest with a cowbird egg in it, or a common yellowthroat feeding a cowbird fledgling. Some ducks are also known to dump their eggs in other species' nests. The only confirmed breeding record we got of redhead during the main bird atlas was a hen ringneck duck seen caring for recently fledged redhead chicks. So those are all the codes, but the last thing we should cover is the fact that there's a difference between breeding and behavior codes. Let's start with the behavior code that is oddly amongst the breeding codes, and that's F, flyover. Notice this is technically an observed code, not breeding behavior, and as the description reads, use it only when all individuals are seen as flyovers. Do not use if just one bird stops or is located feeding on the ground or in vegetation. The important concept is that birds are not using the habitat in any way, which even with a flyover hawk or swallow can be hard to tell if they're just passing by or if they're actually hunting. As always, when in doubt, don't use the code. The other place you'll see behavioral codes is when someone working on an atlas has adjusted your codes for the project. To be clear, no one can change your records. They cannot change the species, the count, or the code you report, but they can change it from a breeding code to a behavior code if it doesn't follow the guidelines of the project. Here are a couple personal examples. First, I reported a male mourning warbler in a regenerating cut, a perfect place for one to breed, but I didn't realize I was still a few days ahead of the safe dates for this species, so my low possible code doesn't count yet. The result is that the Atlas reviewer changed the breeding code to no code, but you can see my code still shows up as a behavioral code. Clicking on the little question mark next to this even explains that it was too early. Another example is with this osprey I saw carrying a stick to a nest. You can see the reviewer changed the code, bumping it up from CN to NB, but that doesn't change the fact that they're both breeding codes. All right, that was a long one. We covered a lot here, and keep in mind that there are many unique cases for individual species and for different projects. Leave a comment if you have a favorite breeding behavior, especially a lesser known one that we can all learn from. And if you found this helpful, hit that like button, and you can help me by subscribing to this channel. I've got some more eBird content coming soon, and as always, thanks for watching.